in this episode of the Critical Oxygen podcast.
If the individual has time to continue to keep that heat protocol within their normal routine, yes, let's just keep doing it because there's benefits that can be had for doing that.
Welcome to the Critical Oxygen podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your endurance potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson. I have a PhD in molecular exercise physiology, and I'm the founder of Critical Oxygen, where my mission is to build better endurance athletes through remote education and in-person physiological testing. Today, I'm joined by continuing guest host, Coach Aaron Geiser, where we answer the question, how to acclimate to racing in hot environments. In this episode, we touch on physiological challenges that are present in training and racing in the heat, and how you should approach heat acclimation leading into a hot and humid race. Overall, heat stress is one of the most challenging things to overcome during racing, but the good news is you can mitigate a lot of those challenges through proper heat exposure. This heat exposure can be 1 to 5 weeks long and be passive or active. Passive heating involves placing yourself in a hot environment, like a hot tub or a sauna, for controlled amounts of time and increasing your exposure progressively. Active heating is exercising in a hot environment, which helps to translate passive heat exposure to race-specific intensities. Heat training, when implemented properly, can confer massive benefits to your ability to race in the heat, so I recommend it for anyone who is healthy enough to actually do it. Speaking of heat training, today's episode is brought to you by our partners at saunamarketplace.com. Sauna Marketplace is the leader in personal temperature contrast solutions. They provide everything from home sauna to cold plunge options and are dedicated to helping you choose the best setup that is right for you. If you've been thinking about getting a cold plunge or adding sauna to your training or wellness regimen, head over to saunamarketplace.com and see what they have to offer. Now, without further ado, please enjoy my most recent conversation with Coach Aaron Geiser, all about heat training. Aaron Geiser, welcome back to the show.
Phil, how are you doing today?
Good, man. It's the spring has sprung, at least here in Oregon. I've had like 3 days of 70-degree weather, so it's been pretty awesome.
Man, you're trying to get me to cuss in the first 20 seconds of this broadcast. We're not having similar weather, so we're just gonna move on.
No, man, I thought that was a perfect intro to the topic that we wanted to talk about today, which is heat acclimation, right?
Well, see, I was looking at it from the passive aspect of things because I got people going out to California racing in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Like, they haven't seen a whole lot of warm weather, so we got to find out a way to get that heat acclimation into the system as well for them.
No, it's both, right? Like I've been lucky enough that I still exercise in the morning, so it's still cool out in the morning. So I'm not like, oh my God, dying of almost heat stroke, in the middle of the day when it's 70 degrees out, it's super sunny. I will say though that I went hiking with the dogs. It was relatively easy, but I did get sunburned and I was only outside for like 35 minutes. So kind of shows I have not been getting any dose of sunlight, at least lately, just because it's been cloudy and whatnot. So, but I do think though, with your athletes racing in a few weeks, and is that mostly at Oceanside?
Yes, Oceanside. Following after that, like 3 weeks, I guess it is, would be Texas as well. And Texas in the woodlands is going to be a pretty hot, and that's going to have a heck of a lot more humidity along with it. That's typically Oceanside. It's not going to be super hot, but a lot of the times, I mean, if you're used to coming out of a Midwest or northern winter, 70 degrees can really take a lot out of you, especially if it's the first time that you've seen sun really in a couple of months. It can really do a number to you. So, Oceanside is not going to be super, super humid, but it has the chance of just being a different environment than what those athletes have been training in most cases.
Yeah. And it's one of those things where if you have ever experienced either change in weather, right? Like you go from like winter and then all of a sudden it's 70 degrees for a week straight, or you go from winter to just a nicer climate to do a race. It's really easy to overdo it. And I think we underestimate our capabilities of exercising in different climates, especially when we are used to, say, cooler, maybe drier temperatures. No, I thought this was a very timely podcast, and who knows, we might release it a little bit earlier than what is currently scheduled, because we still schedule podcasts a long way out. But I think that releasing this in early to mid spring will be beneficial for people who are looking at finding some application to a little bit more getting ready for heat and racing in the heat, or people who qualify for, say, Kona, for example, and want to go and try to brave the heat and the humidity in Kona. Because I'll tell you this, it is a different beast. In Kona is typically is it October?
October.
Yeah. So most of the United States is getting cooler in October. It's not quite as hot as the end of August, middle of August. And then you go over to Kona and it's just like, man, I'm wearing shorts and a t-shirt and I'm still sweating everywhere I go because the relative humidity it seems to be over 100%. So hopefully, for individual, really any individual here who is either going from a transition from cold to a little bit warmer, or moderate to really warm, racing in the world championships or doing anything like that. Hopefully we can give them a little bit of some good key takeaways here today. But what I want to start with is, what the heck happens to your body when you exercise in the heat, and why does it seem way harder to exercise in the heat? I'll let you start and then I can dive in.
Fascinating part of it. I mean, the way that the body tries to adjust on the fly, one is a phenomenal piece of science, but two, when you start to recognize that no longer is the body just trying to fuel muscles, it's now trying to cool the epidermis, and it's also trying to cool internal organs. You start to recognize, it makes a lot more sense why I struggle to make this transition, because really, when we go out and we have a nice, cool or mild temperatured run or ride or anything, our body doesn't have to juggle a whole lot of substance at that point. It really is able to kind of focus on the task, oxygenate the muscles to really allow them to be operating at maximal capacity. But then you add that layer of, whether it be humidity, whether it be heat, whether it be both, then the body then has this, oh crap, moment of, I need to start sending reserves to not just the muscles. I have to send it to these other places. Then when you start to factor on, if you're doing an endurance race and you need to fuel from a nutritional standpoint, it's like, oh, there's another thing that we got to throw at it. So this is really, I think, Phil, from my thought, understanding what is going on in the body is extremely important, because often when people understand the why, they start to figure out or start to understand more about the context, and okay, well, maybe I should decrease my effort by this amount to bring back this and allow other things to go other places. So really, in that case, it's a physiological experiment when we are in this environment. And like anything, if we expose our body to it, we can, in most scenarios, in most cases, we're going to be able to improve the body's capability to tolerate and maximize its response. So in this case, when we are adding heat to the body, and it really even depends on, is there humidity, is there not humidity? Because why we sweat is a mechanism of the body to cope with that heat and provide some cooling aspect. But if you're in humidity, that sweat evaporates and it doesn't do its own job, like the job that it's actually set to do. So To go into the details of this is one, when we are exercising at lower temperatures, we still have some thermodynamics. Our body temperature still does increase, but typically, due to the ambient temperature or the wind that we're creating from cycling or running, what we do is we cool the body naturally, which also helps cool the internal organs to a certain extent. Again, as I said earlier, it just allows the blood and the oxygen to focus on making its way to the muscles to really fuel the activity. When you add heat to the environment, you don't get that same benefit. So therefore, your skin temperature is going up, your core body's temperature is going up. So what the body then does is start to sweat. In that case, the sweating mechanism is to try to create, when that wind or when the ambient temperature hits that wet perspiration, it starts to bring some of that temperature back down. The problem is sometimes the heat is so dramatic that it doesn't play enough. So I know I've kind of jumped around a little bit, but that is what the body is trying to do, is cool these other areas, but it takes focus from just fueling the muscles, as we talked about in the cooler temperatures, to now having to do these multiple tasks where it's not just focusing on one responsibility. So what do you have to add to that one, Phil?
Yeah, so the way that I think about anything nowadays is what is happening adding an extra stress to the body? And if so, how is the body responding? When you are exercising, the primary, or at least the primary goal is to get enough oxygenated blood to the muscle in order to create enough energy to do the contraction that we want to do, which is either running, biking, swimming, strength training, really whatever it is. Most of the times we talk about, things a little bit more from the endurance perspective, just because that is a prolonged, sustained stress on the body. When we, like you were saying, when we're exercising, we also have a little bit of diversion of blood flow to the skin. Diverting blood flow to the skin allows us to exchange warm blood with a cooler temperature, because our skin is presumably closest to the coolest area, which is the outdoors, the environment. So when it's cold outside, right, you do a really good job of cooling the blood. You don't have to push a ton of blood to the skin, and most of that blood can still remain either going to your digestive tract, right, which is what is important for uptaking and utilizing all those nutrients that you're trying to take in, especially during extended endurance events, and pushing that blood to your muscles. But what happens when we start to raise the temperature is we have to start diverting more blood flow to the skin for cooling purposes. The cooling becomes more of a priority. And I can't remember the exact numbers, but you can have a very, very large proportion of the amount of blood that you can pump per minute going to your skin in order to cool yourself, especially in very hot, humid environments like you were saying. But what happens when you start to have so much heat stress that the diversion of that blood flow overtakes where the other blood can go to? Well, you start to pull blood from your digestive tract. So now you can't actually absorb as many carbohydrates, nutrients that you used to be able to do. And to some extent, you might actually start to not prioritize the working muscle. So I think the working muscle still stays pretty high priority, just because of the way that it kind of pulls blood to it. And we don't have to go into that right this second, but it's this teeter-totter effect, right? You have to have enough blood flow in general to cool yourself and get enough oxygen to the working muscle and get enough blood to the digestive system. And your brain. Your brain is super important. Your heart is super important. So you got to make sure you're maintaining blood to those vital organs as well.
Are you sure about that one?
I like to think so. Yeah, and as a muscle physiologist, I will say that sometimes my universe is focused on the muscle, but in all actuality, your body first and foremost is trying to protect blood to your brain and your heart. That's the bottom line, because if you don't have those operating correctly, then you die. It can't be more simply stated. So your body is constantly trying to find this balance and keep you alive, especially during these big stresses. And when it gets hot, you just divert a ton of blood to the skin. And you're not using any oxygen at the skin, but you are moving oxygenated blood to the skin. So you're essentially stealing oxygen from the muscle and putting it to the skin. Now, when it gets humid enough, like you were saying, and you start to sweat, there's no more evaporation of that sweat. So you actually lose one of the ways that your body actually cools itself, which is through evaporative cooling of the sweat. This is why it's so dangerous to exercise in football pads in the middle of August. And this is where, like some track and field or like cross country practices can sometimes be canceled. Football practices get canceled quite a bit, or they do them in the morning, because your body just has no way of actually cooling enough for the level of exertion that you have. And this is where things like heat stroke can come into play. Is like you're literally warming your body up to the point where you're starting to denature and damage proteins. And the only way for your body to stop that is by making it so you can't move or do anything, because any activity that you're doing is just causing that heat stress to be greater. So I think that's the bottom line. And so when you go to hot environments, what actually happens to your physiology? Well, for the same exercise intensity, so say for example, if your Ironman power goal was 200 watts and you had been training this 200 watts in 55 degree weather all throughout the winter, early spring, then you go to Oceanside or you go to Texas and it's 75 degrees and 85% humidity, that 200 watts in the cool environment might elicit 135 beats per minute, maybe a little bit higher. But when you go to Texas, now that heart rate actually climbs up maybe 150, 155. It can get pretty high, because what the heart is trying to do now is it has to beat harder to push more blood, because more blood has to be moved in order to go to the skin and to the muscle at the same time. So that is without any sort of heat acclimation. Your body, your internal stress is just much higher for the same workload, in those hot environments versus those cool temperatures.
And again, the other thing that you also have to kind of play into that factor too for endurance athletes is that there is more blood shunting. There is more things that are having to react at that higher output that you did kind of talk about a little bit, Phil, where you're blood shunting to the stomach, so therefore you're not getting the same nutrient absorption and moving it through the system as much. So I mean, there's a whole bunch of other things that kind of take place at that point. So it's super, super important, this topic today about heat acclimation and giving a process to that. So therefore you aren't just exposing this for the first time on race day or the first couple of times on race day, because it will most likely lead to a poor outcome.
Mm-hmm. And I will say too, your body's ability to move blood, your heart's ability to move blood is finite. You don't have the ability to just continually raise your heart rate higher and higher and higher. There's a reason why we call it max heart rate, is because there's literally a heart rate that your heart can't beat faster than. So you have that, unfortunately, working against you. And then you also have a limited size of your heart as well. So your heart can only push so much per beat, and it can only beat so fast. So your cardiac output can only rise so much. So when you start to pull the demand for blood in multiple different ways, your body eventually just runs out of the ability to increase that. But the good news is, I'm painting this dark story of everybody who races in the heat and stuff like that. You're gonna have a bad day. But the good news is that our bodies are so highly adaptable that by doing heat acclimation or heat training before we go to these races, we can actually help to stimulate our ability to move blood. So that's really kind of what's happening, and that's what we're trying to do by doing this heat acclimation and these heat acclimation protocols. So, do we want to walk through like what actually happens to our bodies when we go through heat acclimation first, and then talk about the application of it second?
I think that, and also kind of differentiating between the timeline that it takes between males and females in this case, because there is a difference between the two sexes.
Okay.
And it also, I think, having everybody have a good understanding of why is a good plan of attack there, Phil. So I think that's the next step.
Yeah. So the main benefit that you are going to get, well, I guess so heat acclimation, just like anything in the body, is time dependent, meaning that you get different physiological adaptations at different times of the heat acclimation period. So early acclimation, what's going to happen is your body is going to stimulate holding on to more plasma. And plasma is that portion of your blood that is like if you spun it down in like a centrifuge, you'd see like all the red, and then you would see kind of like the yellow portion. It's that yellow portion. That yellow portion is really just dictating the volume of your blood. So you increase plasma volume in the very early stages, like 5 to 10 days. And I actually don't know what the difference between male and females are. So I'm actually excited to hear about that. So generally speaking, 5 to 10 days for plasma expansion to occur. And this is as long as you are drinking enough water and rehydrating, adequately, because if you're doing heat acclimation, you're going to be sweating more. But then on top of that, your body wants to hold on to more of that liquid, so then it can ideally turn it into plasma, right? So you get an expansion of plasma volume. That expansion of plasma volume increases your overall blood volume. And that overall blood volume then allows you to have more blood to go to your skin, more blood to go to your muscle. And there's actually some really interesting studies now that are showing that continued heat training, because of this deficit there's another portion of your blood, and it's called the hematocrit. That is the all the red stuff that is spun down, and that is your oxygen carrying red blood cells. That's why it's red. It's because it's got iron in it, and the iron is really what is binding that oxygen and able to actually transport it. So by having plasma expansion, you actually lower your hematocrit levels. And there's a theory that by raising your plasma volume for extended periods of time and having that lower hematocrit, you actually stimulate the creation of red blood cells. And from there, then you start to actually try to balance out your plasma volume with your red blood cells, bringing the hematocrit level back up. So longer term heat training, so this is like 5+ weeks, has been shown to increase, in some people at least, hemoglobin content. So your ability to carry oxygen around your body. So those are the two main things that are actually happening with heat training, are an expansion of plasma volume in the early stages, and then maybe an expansion of hemoglobin in the later stages if you continue it on even longer.
I would also like to add, you start to improve your sweat rate.
Yes.
And you also start to, and this is where it gets dependent on timeline, but you start to bring down your core body temperature slightly at that point. So therefore your ceiling actually ends up at that point where your body has to start making these critical choices of where things are going to go. by the body temperature slightly dropping at that point, you just have a little bit more space between your head and the ceiling at that point before that time of the body saying, okay, well, we need to start distributing things out a little bit differently here. So that is another thing that happens in that early stage. And really in that early stage for males, it's going to be in between kind of the 4 to 10 day process for males. It is then added up to 12 to 14, even 16 for females in that first phase. So this is something that within the protocols that I design for my athletes, this is something that is specific to male, female, of how long and when that process needs to start, because you do just get a little bit of a time, sensitivity in the female body that just takes a little bit longer for that exposure and that first phase to really start taking effect.
Interesting. Yeah, that is never something that I've taught in my exercise physiology class, and that is one of the limitations to, say, previous current body of literature, which now has been expanded towards more females and everything. So it's good that you're making those differentiations. My question would be, is there harm in starting a male earlier, like 16 days out on heat acclimation versus, typical 4 to 10 day of heat acclimation to get the blood, all of those
to be
benefits?
honest, if you give me, if you're pushing me in that, I'm always going to recommend to start that process earlier rather than later, because it just takes out that kind of timeline and deadline to it. Because again, the more exposure that you get, other benefits are going to take place. But the key one is let's say, so one thing that I've found in this, Phil, is that based on what an individual did earlier in life does have an effect on how quickly they also heat acclimate through the process. So if I'm taking somebody through that process the first time, and let's say that they're at the furthest extent of those timelines, I might not have that information until I've worked with them a couple of summers or springs to know how long that process takes. And yes, more consistent exposure, that timeline might shave a day off over the course of years. But for the most part, it's going to give me that opportunity to say, let's start this a little bit earlier, just because it's going to be more beneficial for you. And we're not going to be pressed for time as, oh crap, did we start this soon enough?
Why, whenever you're, or whenever it's just more challenge. But if you're getting the body ready and used to that heat, then you can, I think from a psychological and from a physiological perspective, starting earlier is definitely going to be better, as long as you can maintain that sport-specific training. It's kind of the same thing where, people go up to altitude and are like, oh, altitude's going to solve everything. But one of the challenges with altitude is you can't exercise at the same exercise intensity because it's a larger stress. I would say that's probably pretty similar with heat, because you're going to be limited just by the ability to output power for extended periods of time if you're always training in the heat leading up to a race.
Well, and another thing that I would say is it's 100% the case, Phil, and have those cyclists that you're talking about do that same workout early in a heat acclimation protocol process. Have them go into that hard session with no fan, and then have them go through that session with a fan and tell me which one's going to be a hell of a lot easier in that case. So yes, 100%. But also the other thing about starting it a little bit earlier is I feel like if we wait late, typically as we get closer to the event, the specificity and the intensity gets closer to race pace style efforts. If we are taking you through a heat acclimation process, the stress is already going to be higher. So we need to take into that account that the stresses here from that particular heat protocol, if we take that workout stress to its normal level, that's going to send that individual's overall bucket of stress to a point where they might need additional days of recovery,
Mm-hmm.
have maybe potential breakdowns, especially as you talked about earlier. If they're not properly rehydrating, that's going to set the muscle up for breakdowns in that case. So I like earlier as well, just from the fact that it allows me to do it in not as specific of a phase.
Mm-hmm.
So we pull down the intensity of the effort. We can keep the volume fairly long, and especially just recommend that that individual is rehydrating through the course of that workout. But
Mm-hmm.
we can keep the volume long, but the intensity needs to take a step back. So therefore, we're not overexposing that athlete to too much stress.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another reason why I really like to start the process just a little bit earlier, because I can time those harder sessions around that build properly, that they're peaking at that point, rather than saying, oh crap, I should have probably done this 4 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And then you're like, well, I got to step you back from all these intense workouts for maybe 3 weeks,
Mm-hmm.
then start throwing them back at you for whatever timeline that you have left. So that's another reason why I like to start it just a little bit earlier and then go into a maintenance mode.
Yeah.
And it allows us to maintain while we still are doing some much more specific sessions in that case.
Yeah, and this is the literature that I'm familiar with. What they have shown is that doing so a lot of this literature has taken like elite level or professional, cyclists, and what they do is they take them through. We'll talk about like the longer heat exposure. They take them through 5 weeks of 5 days a week for 1 hour each day. And this is on top of their normal training. So this is a significant amount of extra load, which we can talk about like, oh, do you just, swap out, or do you add like whatever it is? But they add on, an extra hour. But so significant amount for a professional cyclist, not a super, super significant amount, because they're cycling a lot. And then they exercise at at or just below their first threshold. So this is like, traditional zone 2 training, if not a little bit easier, for an hour. And the goal is basically like, I think their internal temperatures, like they're like, oh, we're going to start at 37.5 degrees and work our way up to 38.5 degrees of internal temperature. Basically you just need to be warm. And I don't expect people to take telemetric pills, but this is also where, a device like the core temperature sensor can be useful, is it can help to at least give an idea of where your body temperature is, and if you are elevating it at least a little bit. So that's kind of what they do. And then 3 weeks after that, they'll go to 3 times a week of same intensity, 1 hour on top of their training, but now that's 3 times a week. So that's the maintenance mode that you're talking about. And that's the cool thing, is once you get that wheel spinning, once you get those that heat acclimation, you can maintain it at least for 3 weeks, if not longer, by just minimizing the amount of heat training that you're actually doing. So here's a question that I just thought about now, Aaron, is, do you prefer your athletes to do their heat acclimation on the bike, during the run, whatever it is, or do you use like supplemental heat, like a hot bath or a sauna? And what do you prefer and why?
I prefer passive, just because it's
Okay.
easier to control, and we're not taking away from the comfort of the workout, because we still are trying to maximize growth in the workout.
Mm-hmm.
Now, once we kind of do a passive heat acclimation protocol, then it can kind of be moved into the active protocol as well. But early stages, I prefer passive over active, just because it does not hamper the workout sessions as great in
Mm-hmm.
that environment.
I will say, even though you were calling it passive heat stress, it's still a stress on the body. So you do, as a coach and as an athlete, have to be mindful of the overall volume of stress that you're accumulating and how your body is actually coping with it. Right. It's the same thing like we talked about with cold plunge at one point, is like if you see your heart rate variability just like tank after starting your cold plunge, then most likely you're overdoing it and you should probably back off the time, back off the temperature, that sort of stuff. Same thing with heat.
Absolutely. And recognize when I use the passive, it's more of the application, not
Right.
So just for our listeners, it's more the application is from a passive aspect rather than an active aspect. So I appreciate you further clarifying, but I also want to clarify that it's implemented in that stage.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So, so this is also something that I've kind of been thinking about too. And we warned people about, potential blunting effects of doing cooling immediately following exercise. But in some sense, I almost feel like doing the passive heating immediately following exercise, as long as you're staying hydrated, actually could perpetuate any heat that's already been built up from the exercise that you're doing into a greater heat stress in the passive environment.
Well, this is one of those things where I think people do make mistakes. And it's so I have a rule with my athletes. If we do passive heat acclimation, during that phase, you are not allowed to consume anything.
Oh,
so you can't break
Okay.
during that heat exposure, because every time that you consume something that's not at that same temperature that we're trying to create,
Yep.
you actually bring that body temperature down. So I agree with the hydration standpoint, but it needs to have that context of outside of that timeline. So if you finish your workout, hydrate the heck out of yourself, get into that passive, whether it be a hot tub, whether it be a sauna. In that time frame, my recommendation is we're not touching a thing. We are just allowing that heat to really be absorbed by our body at that point. When you step your butt out of that either hot tub or that sauna, feel free to douse yourself any way that you possibly want to with hydration in that case. But during, I am very, very keen on let's not change the temperature at all, because if you're drinking this super ice cold water, what you're doing is we're trying to heat the core. But if you consume really cold water, you're cooling the core. So you're not getting that same benefit from that particular target. So that's one thing that I'm keen on is, yes, we want to hydrate and we want to make sure that we're hydrating. Or hydrated and hydrating. But we don't want to do it in that environment, because that's just going to it's counterproductive.
Yeah. At the risk of depressing the stress that you're actually trying to get, because then you're depressing the benefits or the adaptations. Okay. I mean, that's great. And then you did say something. So, you said you're okay with hot tub or sauna. Is there a preferred one, and how do they differ in terms of your application? Like, does one have to be hotter than the other, so on and so forth?
So really what we're trying to do is, the point of physiological benefits is 38 degrees Celsius and 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit. So what our goal is to try to get the body above, the core body temperature above those points as quickly as possible. Now, based on the temperatures that you're in, it's more or less going to change the amount of time that you need the exposure. Something that is a little bit cooler might force you to have to take longer amounts of time to get your body up to that temperature. The point of benefit also happens at about 20 minutes. So really what we want to try to do is expose the body to that temperature, 38 degrees Celsius, 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit, for at least 20 minutes. Typically, we want to expand it past that, but at least 20 minutes. And I will have another thing that I will disclaimer that I will add at the end of this. But so typically we're looking at about 104 degrees in a hot tub to get that temperature up as quickly as we can and then start that process of the body. Immersion, you're going to probably have a little bit of a quicker response just because your body is immersed by that 104 degrees right out of the get-go.
Yeah. Water does not allow for, or has more heat transfer, more insulation. So you're going to get more of that heat as opposed to sitting in 104 degree air, right?
Yep. So then I like to see about 180 degrees, which I guess would degrees Fahrenheit for a sauna, but that roughly is going to probably translate to about 86 degrees Celsius, I think.
I can do the math real quick for you.
Maybe it's more closer to 82, but
82.2, yeah.
Okay, so
and this is a dry sauna, not a steam room.
Correct, and I will give a little bit of reasoning behind that too. But as far as that, if you're doing a dry sauna, the timeline can actually be a little bit quicker because the body absorbs that heat differently than it does from an infrared sauna, which would you can still get benefits from an infrared sauna. The research shows that you just have to expose yourself a little bit more because it's not as absorbed by the body as quickly. So what that means is it takes your body longer to hit that point of 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 degrees Celsius to really start to get those benefits. So it just takes a little bit longer. So therefore your exposure just has to be longer in that case. The other thing about, I often get questioned, well, what about a steam room? The problem with the steam room is they're typically about 104 to 108 degrees Fahrenheit, which is not going to be a strong enough exposure for you to get, like you would legitimately have to sit in that sauna or that steam room, I should say, for 90 minutes or longer just to get that kind of benefit.
Yeah.
If you have a home one and you can crank it up a little bit hotter, I know that there's some of these, and I'm going through a test with a current company with hotter steam, but I'm talking it's 160 plus degrees Fahrenheit. So
that's toasty.
And it being humid, it's hot and it's uncomfortable, but I am seeing some benefits there in the early stages, but I'm not willing to say that this is the end all be all or the right process to take yet.
Yeah.
But as far as your kind of communal steam rooms, they just aren't hot enough. Yep. So you're not going to get the benefit from that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, those are all really, really good observations and key points is that with any stress, right, you need to have a certain amount of time and a certain amount of stress that you are trying to convey. And it's going to be different if you are submerging yourself in a hot tub versus a dry sauna versus a near infrared sauna versus a wet sauna or, a steam room.
I remembered what I was going to say.
Okay.
Too.
Yeah. We'll kick it back over to you then, Aaron.
So I did say 20 minutes. Mm-hmm. Now, the one thing that I will say to individuals, sometimes individuals, their first couple of exposures, they can't last 20 minutes. Yep. So I don't want individuals to take this past that point of where they maybe are starting to get woozy or they're passing out in one of these scenarios. So traditionally with my athletes, I send them in for a baseline. So I just tell them we're not looking at necessarily getting heat acclimation benefits on this first session. Right? This first session, I am just trying to get the amount of time that you can comfortably or tolerate time in that environment. Mm-hmm. So my goal is I'm going to send you in there and I just want you to go for as long as you possibly can until you just feel uncomfortable or you just need to get out. And then that time is going to then provide me with a valuable protocol for that particular individual of how long we're going to start to, or how long we're going to start them in from a time standpoint, and then how we're going to stagger them up to the time that I need them to be in there and how frequently we're going to do it. So the disclosure, or I wanted to just make sure that everybody doesn't go in and say, well, I got to be in there for 20 minutes because Aaron said so.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't tolerate it, please do not go in there and take your health to a extreme point if you can't handle it.
Yeah, and this is the same thing that, like the same caveat that I give to everybody is like Aaron and I, as much as we actually do know and all of that sort of stuff, we are not medical doctors. So make sure that you have all of your ducks in a row in terms of, is your cardiovascular system healthy enough to handle the heat, the cold, whatever stresses that you're going to be putting onto it, even exercise, before you actually start to do these sort of protocols. That being said, I like where we're going with this, because right now we have, like the acute or the short-term period, right? For males seems to be 4 to 10 days of heat exposure or heat acclimation. For females, it's probably longer, up to maybe 16 days and probably a minimum closer to 12. And then you're working your way up. Or what you're trying to do is you're trying to hit that internal core body temperature of like 38 degrees C or 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit. And you're working your way up to 20 minutes at that internal core body temp. And the way you get there is going to be different depending on if you are in a hot tub, a dry sauna, a near-infrared sauna, or a steam room. Steam rooms may not be the best answer right now, but there might be certain steam rooms that can do hotter. And with that, with that increased level of relative humidity, you're certainly going to get potentially larger, or you're going to minimize the amount of cooling, so the heat stress may be a little bit larger if it's actually warm enough. So now the question is the studies are showing, probably like an hour, or I guess from the passive setting, 20 minutes at 30 degrees. But they would say, 5 days a week for the 2 or 3 weeks that you want to try to get that acclimation. Where do you start your individuals with, like, without giving away, your exact protocols or anything like that? Do you go start with 3 days a week, or do you start with even, 2 days a week, split it up? Like, do you have a way that you kind of approach it?
I do. The protocol typically is 4 days out of the get-go.
Okay.
And then it's because the one thing I'll say is the research and literature shows that if you take more than 2 days away, you have a back step. So I look at it from that perspective of, if it's 4 days, and as long as it's not 4 consecutive days, it's going to provide the timeline that we need to, and it's going to provide the exposure that we need to get that accomplished of that first stage in place.
Into the heat, how many, and it would depend. But I think sticking with these general guidelines of you want to work from 4 days a week to, do you get people up to 7 days a week of heat training or heat acclimation? What's your kind of your max? Yeah, what's your max?
I mean, it's going to depend on the athlete. It's going to depend on what we're getting ready for. So I do feel like that is more of a very individualized question. And there's some people that don't respond really well to heat in general.
Mm-hmm.
If you expose them to 7 days of work, they're gonna run themselves into a wall, and it's going to affect every aspect of their life. I mean, not just workouts. It's going to throw off hormones. It's going to throw off a lot of different things, and that's not a line that I'm ever willing to cross in that case. So I don't think that's an answer that I feel confident in providing, because there's not one for one individual.
Yeah, and working your way up to 7 days a week is probably not the best way to do it for most people, right? Unless you absolutely love, getting in and doing your sauna stuff and other things like that. Doing it on top of the exercise,
stress
right?
on every other aspect to it, to me.
Yeah.
So it, we have to be so precise. And most people, yeah, they'll tell you they are, but they're far from it. Anytime that, hey, my nutrition's great. Okay, write it down. Let's take a look. What? So I don't, it's one of those situations where if you're doing that, I think the monitoring that needs to be surrounded around that is so great that most people don't have that support staff or
Mm-hmm.
don't have that kind of setup to be able to be flirting with that kind of a line.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And this is like again a little bit of a difference between performance and wellness. If you're in the wellness crowd, then maybe you can get away with doing a little bit more sauna and those sort of things, and then mitigating your exercise training and things like that. But if you're doing performance, and if you are striving, for that top level of performance, you're balancing every level of stress, and you have to be very, very precise with the introduction of more stress. And like we said earlier, heat is absolutely a stress, and it's really, really easy to overdo it. So don't overdo it. I would say like almost err on the side of caution, which is typically how I give general recommendations, is like err on the side of caution. Even though there are certain benchmarks you need to hit, like the 20 minutes at 38 degrees Celsius, but I would say that even if you can only get to 10 or 15, that's still better than not doing any heat acclimation at all, right?
When in time you're going to get better at
Exactly.
tolerance. So I mean that's the key is. But I should you touched on this a little bit, but from a health standpoint and from a sports performance, these are like the health person might, or the person that's taking it from a health response might only be able to get away with 15 to 20 minutes every day,
Mm-hmm.
where I might be pushing an athlete up to one. I mean, if it's in a sauna, maybe I'm pushing them to 40 minutes.
Yeah.
If they're outdoors, they might be cycling for 5 hours. So, I mean, these are extreme amounts of time. That person that's probably just trying to sweat out some toxins, trying to make their skin a little bit healthier, it's a completely different, like, response, and you're trying to complete or accomplish two completely different tasks.
Yes.
So don't compare those two in any manner just because they're two separate aspects. So know what you're doing it for.
Yep. Today's episode is brought to you by our partners at saunamarketplace.com. Sauna Marketplace is the leader in personal temperature contrast solutions. With everything from portable sauna tents to cold plunge setups and high-end luxury saunas, they have what you're looking for. SaunaMarketplace.com offers the lowest allowable pricing on all of their products and guarantees that if you find the same product elsewhere for a better price, they'll match it. With their wide variety of available products and their whatever it takes philosophy on customer service, they will help you find the temperature contrast solution that is right for you. So no matter if you're looking for a sauna to prepare for a hot race or want a cold tub to help aid recovery, give the experts at saunamarketplace.com a call, text, or chat to find the best solution for you. That's saunamarketplace.com. The link is in the description below. Now, back to the show. Yep, exactly. Okay, so my last question, I guess, for you is like, have you ever found benefits to extended, say passive heat, or, well, I guess I got two questions. So extended passive heat, so kind of like this idea of like heat training is the poor man's altitude training, where you can expand hemoglobin levels and other things like that. And B, is there ever a point where you go from the passive heat to active or exercise based heat stress, just as more specific towards somebody's race?
So, first question I would answer is yes. If the individual has time to continue to keep that heat protocol within their normal routine, yes, let's just keep doing it because there's benefits that can be had for doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I'll have individuals that they get to the off season, they keep that same heat protocol, but they back off of their exercise. So, I mean, there's still some things that we are getting benefit from there. But if that individual's like, well, I'm kind of pressed for time, I'd prefer to back off maybe 5 or 6 hours already.
Mm-hmm.
That might be something that I'll just pull off because I mean, if you have the luxury of having a sauna in your house or a hot tub, that's one thing. But if you don't go into the gym, I mean, getting people to the pool sometimes is a complicated process. Let's then have you do an hour swim and then sit into a sauna for 30 to 40 minutes
Yeah.
throughout the entire course of the year. That's probably, I mean, sometimes you just need to step away and say, I'm going to give this person a mental reset, and that would be something that I would take off of their table. As far as the active exposure, yes, once you have gone through, so to give a little bit more detail on timeline, so that first phase that we've talked a lot about during this first 53 minutes is there's a second phase to it. And the second phase is where the sustainable and more pronounced physiological benefits are going to come from. And this, for males, is going to be roughly 14 to 21 days. Females is going to be 21 to 28 days of exposure. So again, what you're going to do is, as we talked about, higher blood plasma, higher sweat rate, lower core body temperature. You're also going to become more comfortable in those high temperatures. You're also going to change some physiological responses of just how efficient the body is then going to make those adjustments as we started the conversation of where are resources being sent. Mm-hmm. It's able to acclimate itself and send reserves to the right places more efficiently and quicker. Mm-hmm. So in this case, once we get to kind of that, once we're moving from stage 1 to stage 2 in that case, if we're going to call it that, that's where I start to say, hey, we can start to get this into the environmental piece of it. Let's get some exposure, but still we're going to try to control a little bit of that intensity. So still kind of playing that, let's control what we can, give some harder sessions around the indoor scenario where we can control the temperature, send that individual out into the hotter environment with more of an aerobic style workout. These are going to be extremely important. And that is kind of that timeline that I start to send individuals out for that active exposure is kind of as they have started that first phase and starting to move into that second phase.
Mm-hmm. And are you maintaining then the passive heat, or are you transitioning almost exclusively to active?
I think always having passive is going to be important, just because you're able to control more of that environment. And also, as I get closer to race day, I even in the summer months, I shouldn't say even, but in the summer months, I start to have those critical late workouts. Let's say that it's a 1K repeat, or we have some continuous race pace efforts on a run. Mm-hmm. I like to pull the individual indoors and have them in a cooled environment if we've done all these other things, because they're less likely to have breakdowns from soft tissue injuries and maybe going into the session dehydrated, especially those individuals that are working and maybe even have a stressful work. They're more likely to get behind on nutrition. They're more likely to get behind on hydration. So I try to keep them in a little bit more of a controlled environment. But I always think passive is going to be better, because then it's not going to put the stress on the athlete to look, well, gosh, I got to get outside this many times this week just in case it's not feasible. Sometimes, like for myself, if I want to go ride outside in a kind of more comfortable environment, not temperature-wise, but more from a car standpoint, I got to drive 40 minutes there, 40 minutes back, so I'm dedicated an hour and a half. I'm not going to do that. So if I was trying to get exposure in that environment, I would need to, I need to go outside. So I need to plan this 1 or 90-minute trip around that training volume that I'm putting in to get that done. So passive is just much more it's easier for me to control, but I'm still, hey, let's get outside a couple of times to get that exposure. But keeping that passive is, to me, is important, because it just, one, it gives the option, it gives the alternative to the athlete, and it also gives them a, well, if things don't play out, I'm not going to stress out about it because I can go and get my exposure from that.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that. It's, at the heart of it, right. You're at this point, you're just trying to translate that heat adaptation that you got from the passive exposure to the active or the exercising now. And if you unfortunately can't do it because it is cold outside, or you can't, just make it work with your schedule, then you still have the passive, heating and everything, which is still, again, it's better than nothing. Absolutely. So it's just a matter of how you translate that passive heat to the active at this point. So then I guess my last question is, leading into, say, like a taper, do you keep, you probably keep the passive heating, all the way through. No, you pull it.
Yeah, we'll go into that, but ask your two-parter there.
Yeah. Okay. So I was going to say, so, it's like, how do you maintain the heat in terms of a taper? And yeah, I guess that's the question, is how do you maintain heat, during the taper? Because if you can't, because one of the things that I've seen is that, because plasma volume comes up so quickly, it actually decreases really quickly as well. So if you take that away, then presumably you might be limiting your plasma volume going into the hot race.
So one, hopefully what we've done is we've overworked from a stress standpoint up to that point of the taper. Mm-hmm. So therefore that step back that you talked about is not going to be as dramatic, because there is something that we're going to do in that case. So there's a couple of different questions that are going to need to be answered before you actually have the exact process scheduled.
Right.
Because right now, a lot of my athletes travel to races. Okay. So one, not only am I trying to taper them from recovering, but I'm also trying to taper the stress going into that travel, because travel is often very, very stressful. Mm-hmm. So the reason why I shook my head to your answer of no, because 2 weeks out, I typically pull them off of the heat protocol, mm-hmm. and I still have intensity, decreased volume in that training week. Mm-hmm. We're leading them into a travel, whether it's even, unless it's in their backyard, but in most cases they're doing some form of travel. So I'm leading them into that travel with a little bit less volume, so we have a little bit of a spike of recovery. Mm-hmm. Then we get them to the location, hopefully, and let's say somebody that's going into a Saturday race goes in on Thursday or even Friday in some cases. Yeah, we're going to do a little bit of a different case where we probably would run them up a little bit closer to that timeline. Mm-hmm. But somebody that's, let's say, getting Saturday, Sunday race there Monday or Tuesday, we're going to stop that week before. We're going to keep the intensity, lower the volume, maybe decrease the intensity later in that week to the travel point. Get them traveled, get them there. First day is an easy aerobic something. Mm-hmm. No heat exposure. Then that second day is, let's go ahead and get out in the environment. Let's go ahead and have another mildly easy day or moderate day. Then that second, like that day after. So technically the landing day is day one. That day two, we're getting a little bit of exposure, but in an aerobic. Day three, we are then kind of, let's go ahead and get full exposure and a little bit of a primer per se. Mm-hmm. And then the rest, like, we're probably starting to decrease on intensity at that point of the week, but we want to get another day or two of being outside in the elements, just not as long.
Yep.
Get the small dose, so therefore we're not having to step back. We're not trying to gain anything at that point. We're just not trying to step back. Mm-hmm. then we lead them into that race. And another thing that I often tell my athletes is don't be afraid of, if you're in a warm place, don't be afraid of absorbing all of the air conditioning leading up to an event, because we want the body to be as cold outside of that environment as we possibly can. But when we're out, we want to try to just accomplish that task of that kind of 20 minutes of exposure and then keep it at the level that we worked so hard to get to.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. Again, it's I love your answers because it's all about balancing all the other stresses, right? Because if you were so myopically focused just on heat stress, then you'd be like, yeah, of course we're going to keep the heat stress. And then, and then you kind of lose sight of the ultimate goal, which is the actual race performance. And to get to the race in the most optimal shape possible, you really, really, really have to balance all of that stress and everything like that. Man, this is an awesome conversation. I really hope people take away a lot from this heat acclimation talk, because it's a perfect intermingling of what's the science saying and how do we actually translate it. If you guys have any questions for Aaron and I, you can always find me on Instagram at Critical02. You can comment down below if you're on YouTube. You can leave us a comment on Spotify. If you've made it here on Spotify, please leave us a 5-star review. It really helps push the podcast out and get more eyes and views on it. If you have any questions for Aaron, or you want to inquire about him being your coach, reach out to him at Try a Geiser. He is one of the few people that I would recommend people to look for coaching from. I don't know if he's taken any new clients, but that's my shameless plug for him. Aaron's awesome.
And thanks for allowing me to give the information, but also not give my protocol, because I do think that the protocol is kind of a specially researched and tested process that has shown results.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, if people are wondering, it's like, what do you get by hiring Aaron as a coach? You get, personalized, tailored training and racing advice from somebody who has had success coaching people, at the pro level, age group level, those sort of things. And you also get all of the recommendations in terms of the heat training protocols and like all of that are hyper individualized to you. So this wasn't meant to be like an ad for Aaron Geiser coaching, but I think it's a good enough time as any to have you guys, if you are interested in getting a good triathlon coach, definitely reach out to Aaron and see if he would be a good fit for you guys.
But it is also exciting that we do have a sponsor for this episode too. Yeah. So we're moving in the right direction.
Yeah. And it's not Aaron is not the sponsor of this episode. So Yeah. So you probably heard the ad read earlier in the episode, but we teamed up with a company called saunamarketplace.com, and their whole goal is to make the sauna or just temperature contrast buying process a lot easier for everybody. So they're really focused on taking you as the customer through, a individualized process of buying either a cooling cold plunge devices, or sauna or hot tub. And they give you all the recommendations based on your needs, your budget, other things like that. So if you're interested in potentially checking out, like getting a personal sauna, personal hot tub, personal cold plunge, go to saunamarketplace.com. But we highly recommend them because they are highly, highly personalized and focused on getting you, the client or the athlete, the best outcome or the best setup possible. With that, we hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Again, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to ask us, and we'll catch you in the next one.